Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's solo flight special is being captained by Wright. We know you have a choice in your radio listening pleasure, and we would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, so please fasten your seatbelts and ensure that all seatbacks and tray tables are stowed in the upright and locked positions. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as we cruise above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style. Once again, we thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we're confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment, quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, I'm sure you all witnessed Megyn Kelly's shameful rant back on Monday with respect to an open letter by a GOP presidential candidate negotiator with respect to how the candidates will be treated during the next series of televised presidential candidate debates. And this is perfectly understandable that the GOP would be pushing for these sorts of conditions that are contained within that letter after the sort of treatment that the candidates received not only from CNBC in this last fiasco of a debate, but also their treatment at CNN by the moderators. You know, Jeremy and I have oft-times repeated on previous episodes of the Wright Flyer that the media is really doing a great disservice to the American people. In fact, the entire impetus and reasoning behind having these debates is so that the American electorate can gain a better knowledge of the candidates with respect to what positions they hold. And this is exceptionally important when it comes to their stance on the scope and application of our shared United States Constitution. That is because the only litmus test that matters in determining whether an individual is qualified to hold the highest office in the land is how they are with respect to the Constitution. In other words, are they willing to strictly adhere to the sacred and fundamental principles contained within the four corners of that document? Because as we all know, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And therefore, we should all know what the presidential candidate's stance is with respect to the Constitution, because it is through the Constitution that they will actively have the authority to govern. And that also explains why it is a true qualifier and the only litmus test that should be applied. Yet the mainstream media continues to embrace its undeniable bias and asking skewed questions, and it's really detrimental. Now, I know that some out there are saying that some of these demands by the GOP negotiator are just outrageous and ridiculous. However, if you look back to the history of presidential debates and one of the first ever nationally televised presidential debates, you can understand why the political bigwigs of the Republican Party would be concerned with things such as the temperature in the room. Because if you go back to the Nixon versus Kennedy debate that was televised in 1960, those audience members that listened to the debate on the radio said that Nixon had won hands down. But those who saw Nixon on television said that he didn't look presidential. And it makes sense. He was sweating profusely, he looked nervous, even though his answers were direct and on point. And he did seem to have a better grasp on the issues. Well, you can control a lot of what the audience sees perspective-wise if you control the camera angles, you control the lighting and temperature within the room, and it is only natural that the negotiator who speaks on behalf of the prospective candidates would attempt to procure the best type of setting for their candidates. And when you see the types of questions that are being asked where candidate is pitted against candidate, it really is not a good format, because again, it does not delve into the policy positions held by each respective candidate, and it just attempts to paint them in a negative or harsh light. And the fact that Megyn Kelly can't seem to understand this, or is willfully blind to this fact, and goes on to the air making a fool of herself by lampooning it as, well, do you want a foot or neck rub too? That's ridiculous, because it shows that she doesn't care about the disservice that is being done to the only people who matter with respect to any and all of this, and that is we, the people of the United States, because we are the absolute sovereigns in this country, and we are the ones that make the determination of who will actually be our next president. But this also plays into the bias that exists at Fox. Again, those on the radical and extremist fringe of the left in this country sit there and say that the Fox News channel is basically in the back pocket of conservatives. Well, no, it's not. They are in the back pocket of the detente wing of the gutless opposition party. But that is certainly not the sort of people that most Americans are. We don't really support those who are going against the fundamental tenets that are contained within the four corners of the United States Constitution. And it would be foolish for us to do so, because by stripping away our fundamental and unalienable rights, the government is actually working against our best interests. America is strong when her people are strong. And that means when the government is limited and not allowed to step upon or encroach upon or abridge the fundamental and unalienable rights of the people. That just speaks to common sense. And again, it just explains why Megyn Kelly's rant on Monday was so shameful. And if she continues down this path, it's going to strip her show of any credibility. In fact, I think it already has. I think you ought to just stick a fork in her and call it done. But this idea that Fox is just all-out conservative makes no sense, because if you look, they have Karl Rove on almost every other day as a pundit, and he is clearly a member of the detente or establishment wing of the gutless opposition party. And yet he is given enormous amounts of credibility at the Fox News channel. But he shouldn't be, because everything that he has done and propagated and pushed upon the American people has been disastrous. Why? Because it is devoid of any true authority from the United States Constitution. In fact, his policy positions are diametrically opposed to the fundamental tenets that are contained within the Constitution. And that is why, again, when it comes to the nationally televised presidential debates, that we want to know what the policy positions are with respect to the candidates and how they would go about leading the country. Would they adhere to those sacred constitutional principles? Because when you come down to it, that is really all that matters. But, you know, when when I talk to people about this sort of thing, I get a lot of questions about, well, why is the media this way? We don't know where this media bias comes from. How long has it been about? Well, folks, media bias and sensationalism is clearly nothing new within the confines of the mainstream media. It goes all the way back to a man named William Randolph Hearst. But before I go into Hearst's dynasty and the way that he consolidated the sources of media, I need to point to a time when each and every little American town had its own local independent newspaper, and we had a wide variety with respect to the sources of news and information that were available to the general population. And through that wide, diverse body of news and information sources, the American people could pick and choose and discern for themselves what the truth was. And journalists of that time really did have this sort of ethical obligation and creed where they would go out and do their darndest to present an objective story, to provide people with information without the taint of any sort of bias or agenda. Unfortunately, with William Randolph Hearst, all of that got thrown out the window. We now started to see him gobble up all of these little independent local newspapers that I had just mentioned and concentrate the power of the media into a small grouping of newspapers. And he became phenomenally wealthy as a result of that. He was basically the George Soros of his day. And it's the same type of problem we're seeing now, just on an exponentially larger scale. And that's because the media itself has different outlets and avenues, and again, they're being condensed to even smaller numbers. But William Randolph Hearst was famous for what was known at the time as yellow journalism. That was sensationalism at its absolute worst. He would go out and fabricate stories in order to shift American public opinion with respect to topics such as the conditions in Cuba in the lead up to the Spanish-American War. He helped hype sensationalized stories that weren't true about atrocities that had occurred in order to really fan the flames of public opinion back home in the States, to also ensure that the American people would wholeheartedly support Theodore Roosevelt's campaign to wage war in Cuba. And it worked. It worked. And that was the first time that the media ever saw the great potential of yellow journalism or sensationalism as a tool for propaganda. And they began to go down the path of that sort of sensationalism, this radical agenda-driven media, because they thought, you know, it'll sell, but it will also allow us to control the outlook in the country and the way that the people think in the country. Now, William Randolph Hearst was basically the only one at that time that thought that way. And it wouldn't be until much later that the media would evolve to be the sort of cynical and opinionated, arrogant, you know, just basically going off the checklist for Megyn Kelly here, type of pundits that just rant and rave and give their opinion, and we, the people, are just supposed to sit back, shut up, and accept it as fact. That was a long and drawn-out process, and we're going to go a bit more into it. But, you know, the other aspect of what really changed the way journalism was practiced in America was the development of the telegraph story. All of a sudden, you could now have national events reported in all of those now disappearing local and independent newspapers in an instant, because the telegraph office could have a story wired in from the press. And this is where the Associated Press started to come together, to where they could get these central stories to make sure that their audience would have near instantaneous access to the news. It was really a radical and revolutionary development with the way that information was disseminated. And it changed the art of journalism forever. Basically, the true integrity style of journalism, where they went forward to present stories in an objective fashion so that the American population might get the truth, that started to die. And that was the first death nail of it. The telegraphed news story in conjunction with William Randolph Hearst's consolidation of the various media sources and outlets. Then we see by World War I, there is a new type of media source and outlet that is developed that's a huge, big business. And it wasn't just used for news, because there were newsreels, but Hollywood and entertainment and telling stories and allowing greater audiences to see this basically marvelous shadow flickering on a silver screen was big business. It was a new thing, totally revolutionary. And Woodrow Wilson's administration had a stranglehold on the sorts of information that was allowed to be put out. And that included up to the type of movies and stories which would be shown in movie theaters throughout the country, and what would be included in newsreels. But the very fact that they had gotten to a point where they would censor movies, this new medium, if it didn't preach or propagate the message of the government, it shows that, again, the government was getting very far astray from the fundamental tenets and principles contained within the four corners of our shared Constitution. The First Amendment, the freedom of the press, was actually designed to ensure that the press would be a watchdog for the American people, to let them know whenever the government was running astray of those sacred constitutional principles and fundamental and unalienable rights which are shared and enjoyed by each and every American citizen. But they have been derelict in their duty. And it all goes back to these historical developments that were occurring. And it really came to a head for the first time as a milestone with the amount of control and censorship that the government wielded during the First World War. So, as I said, by World War I, we had the new media of film, which allowed newsreels to be done, which allowed movies to be made, and again, it was a new step in propaganda. But you have to remember that those early newsreels really were kind of limited in what they could do. They'd have the image, but at that time they hadn't devised a way to synchronize picture and sound yet. They had some early attempts, but they weren't loud enough for an entire theater to hear. So these early newsreels were silent, and a live announcer would read from a script to explain the stories unfurling on the screen. So it could be a bit campy, and you'd probably have a tinkling piano in the background as he's reading. I get this image of Snidely Whiplash hiding behind a rock as the reporter was reporting the story as the news unfurled on the screen. And that's kind of where the term reporter, at least with respect to the moving picture type media, came from, because it would be this type of interaction with the audience. Now, of course, being a live person there reading these stories out, they could also be targeted by the audience members if the story was something that they didn't care about or disagreed with. Almost like the old melodrama plays where you could crumple up paper and throw them at them. Well, you could do that to the news anchors that were reading these stories as the silent newsreel played out. However, there was a new development, technologically speaking, in the 1920s that threatened not just Hollywood, but the newsreel industry too. All of a sudden, the radio was available, and you could hear the voice of someone far away that had direct access to the news and information as it was happening, read into a microphone, and you could hear their voice. And it would be like listening to that guy reading the news reports for the silent films, but you could do it from the comfort of your own home. Why would you even want to go to the theater? You'd have to get dressed up, you'd have to spend money to do it. Basically, with a radio, it's a one-time fee, and your electric bill, and you can enjoy it in the comfort of your own home. And that really started to change, again, the way that news was presented. And I had mentioned that William Randolph Hearst had been the first real news or media personality to go forward with sensationalism, but the Warner Brothers, yes, the same one that is the movie makers, they had a studio and they wanted to keep bringing people to their theaters, with the theaters that they contracted with to release their pictures, and so they decided that what really sold would be to send their cameramen to catch these ghastly, sensational images that radio just couldn't convey. And therefore, they would send their cameramen, to watch barnstorming things and to watch human flies crawling up the side of a building. It was basically just worthless stuff, but it was exciting and exhilarating, and it brought audiences in. And that was what all of the movie studios started doing with respect to the newsreels. They wanted to hook their audiences, capture them, bring them in so that they could sell more and more tickets. Well, scandal and sensationalism seemed to be the path by which that they could capture the greatest number of audience members. And so newsreels started to go more and more and more sensationalistic, whereas the radio continued down the traditional journalistic tendency of providing an objective story and letting the listening audience make up their minds for themselves, to make the determinations and decisions for themselves, that this was just the information to guide them in their decision making. But the newsreels, having gone to this radical sensationalism route, had actually started to continue to propagate the claim that they were presenting these images in an objective fashion, but they really weren't. They had an agenda. They had that hidden agenda, but the audience really wasn't privy to that knowledge, or didn't recognize it, or if they did, they ignored it, and it just continued unchecked. Well, we see that the sensationalism led to greater sales, but it also had a detrimental impact with respect to how newspapers delivered stories. Back to William Randolph Hearst, not to be outdone by these radical new technologies, Hearst also became increasingly sensational in his stories. He would actually, what we would call today, Photoshop image. He faked images and accounts of real events. And just to keep it kind of in the historical context of the movie industry at this time, being silent films, I point to the 1921 case of Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. Now, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was one of the most popular comedians of the silent era. He was one of the big ones, up there with Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd. He was part of the big movie royalty with respect to comedy. He basically got started with the great comedy director Mack Sennett. Now, why is all of this important? Well, in 1921, he was hosting a party, and of course Prohibition was in full swing at that time, and there was a lady who went in to one of the bedrooms after drinking profusely, even after her doctor said, if you ever drink again, you'll die. And she had a ruptured bladder and died. But the police, and then later the district attorney, believed that Roscoe, and as you can guess by his nickname, Fatty Arbuckle, he was a rather portly fellow, Arbuckle had basically raped this woman, and her name was Virginia Rapé, and that he had, from his massive girth, ruptured her bladder, causing her to die a horrific death. Well, no, it wasn't true. This was actually being peddled by a madam, because Virginia Rapé was a kind of on and off again movie star who was actually a harlot, a prostitute, and it was her madam who, yes, went by the moniker Madam Black, really spinning this story, and William Randolph Hearst ran with it. He took photographs of Fatty from his movies and then superimposed prison bars on it to make it look as though his reporters had gotten down to the exclusive scoop by going to the prison and capturing these images of Fatty Arbuckle. But the thing was, they were all faked. Absolutely all faked. Again, he was moving towards his agenda. It wasn't just selling papers. He also wanted to have greater control over the movie industry, and he thought it should have been in Northern California instead of Southern California, and so he saw this as a chance to ruin the reputation of Hollywood, and he basically was doing that. That's what brought in the Hays Code, allowed more censorship, and this also created that type of mentality or mental image that the media likes to shroud itself in, that they are the guardian of the people. Well, they thought that they would guard the decency of the American people, but nothing could be further from the truth when you actually look at what was being done. But, that was just the step of it. But to also show his agenda, it was a third trial, because there were basically 3 mistrials with the Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle case, where the jury actually said that a great disservice had been done to Mr. Arbuckle, and that they wanted to state how sorry they were for what happened to him, and so they wrote an open letter to one of William Randolph Hearst's papers. But instead of being front-page news, as all of these salacious and propagandistic yellow journalist stories that were, just character assassination of the worst sort, this was tucked away on the last page of the newspaper. And that just shows, again, the type of propaganda and agenda that William Randolph Hearst could do. And it also explains why Orson Welles had made the movie Citizen Kane. That movie was an attack against the sort of power that William Randolph Hearst had amassed for himself, and the type of illegitimate sort of sensational journalism that he had developed. I mean, sensationalist journalism really did destroy lives, and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was proof of that. And to draw a parallel with a more modern case of where something like that happened, think of the Duke Lacrosse story. Because that goes down the lines of that, a fake claim of rape, ruining the lives of people, being pushed by a corrupt district attorney, and justice not really being found. That was there, and the media had run with that story, like they have with various false rape accusation stories. Folks, rape is such a serious crime that it shouldn't be marginalized in such a way. It shouldn't be politicized or used as a political weapon for political gain because you don't like something, or to push an agenda because you think that this sort of sensationalism is going to boost your viewership and your audience and your ratings. No. That's not entertainment. That's not information. That is just sheer, unadulterated character assassination, and it is completely unethical. But that was the sort of unethical beast that the mainstream media was turning into even as early as 1921. And, you know, Roscoe never got his career back. Fatty Arbuckle couldn't get a movie. None of the producers would allow him in. None of the studios would let him film again. He was ruined. Absolutely ruined. And the media played a central role in that. So this idea that there is a biased media, an agenda-driven media, being a new thing is just absolutely not the case. Truth be told, this has been happening for almost well over a century. And it's just getting worse, with the likes of people like George Soros. George Soros is hardly different than William Randolph Hearst was. He controls a vast majority of the few remaining media outlets that are out there, and they bow to his will, which happens to be a radical, extremist, left-wing ideology that he wants peddled into the living room of each and every decent, hard-working American citizen. But it's not reflexive of what the country is really like, and it's not reflexive of the truth, because, the truth is the greatest casualty of the way that this media has developed in America. Because the mainstream media no longer cares about the truth. The truth isn't sexy. It doesn't sell. But it ought to. Because through truth we find the ability to set ourselves free. Through truth, we can set ourselves on the path to attain greater prosperity than we can otherwise. And yet, what we see with the mainstream media is that we are embracing, or at least they are embracing, the sort of things that throttle true progress, the things that impede growth in this country. And they do it with glee. They work against the American people with absolute glee. And that is just sickening. It's horrifying if you stop and think about it. But it's not new, because it does go back to the 1920s. Well, radio still continued to zap away the viewership and audiences from the silent pictures, and this included the newsreels. Well, not to be outdone, the Warners decided that they'd take a risk on a new type of technology that was finally developed that allowed pictures to be synchronized with sound. Now, it was on a phonograph record, and you'd have to get it just right, or else the synchronization would be totally off. But this was known as the Vitaphone process, and they were the first to do it. And they went out, and they started making sound newsreels. Those were the first to actually have sound. And all of a sudden, you'd see the politician, or whatever the subject of the newsreel was, up on the screen, and you could hear them. You could hear them talk. You could hear any audience that was around them. You could hear music in the background. And then they even started adding soundtracks, epic orchestral pieces, to the news, to once again heighten the sensations that you would have watching it. Sensationalism grew by leaps and bounds with the advent of talking pictures. And the Warners were the first to do it. It then was simplified to a sound wave printed on film that would play simultaneously through a singular projector, and that was William Fox's company that first did it. So the Fox newsreels were actually the first to have this kind of sound on film process. And so all of a sudden, it was like radio and film had married. And just as I had said earlier that film really had embraced sensationalism but continued to claim that they were objective, now you had not only the claim that the pictures being shown were objective, when in fact they weren't, but you also had the advent of the news reporter, again, being actually in the film, being able to convey the story with the picture superimposed and with music playing in the background without the need of the tinkling piano and the live reporter actually standing there, and this idea of what they are telling me is the objective and absolute truth. And the audience has bought it. And so the power of the mainstream media, as we would understand it today, was actually beginning to develop by the early 1930s, because the sound or talking pictures, sound movies, was developed as early as 1927. That's when The Jazz Singer was shown. That is the death knell of the silent movie in America. Well, although it continued into the 30s, it was basically a dead art by that point, and clearly a dead art with the newsreel, because now people wanted to hear a reporter on the film discussing the scenes and events that were being documented. And so, in a way, this early news media was kind of our first documentaries, if you stop and think about it. But what we see now is that news had become show business. You know, you had ever more elaborate camera angles with full orchestral soundtracks just there printed on the film, and you can see just how powerful it was when you look at the footage that the media had with respect to the Hindenburg disaster. You know, that great giant Zeppelin or blimp, that cigar balloon type thing with a rigid air dirigible bursting into flames, and you could hear the panic, excitement, and emotion in the voices, or rather in the voice of the reporter while watching it, you know, to just go ablaze on the screen. And that sold tickets. That packed the theaters like nothing before could have. And so now the media started to see, hey, look, not only is sensationalism big business, but we also now have tragedy and a massive scale where we can play it up with orchestral music. We can have our announcer basically weeping on the microphone and sell it to the public. And we can sell it for a premium. And that's exactly the path that the media went down. And you can still see elements of that in the news media today. Now, sure, during the silent era, yes, they would go out and film sensational things like car wrecks or accidents at a automobile race, and that sold tickets. It also made the stuntman's life in the actual movie industry hell, because he would have to do more and more dangerous, bone-curdling stunts for the audience to believe it, because they'd watch these real crash on the newsreels. And so objectivism and objective journalism were essentially thrown out the window in order to propagate these sorts of radical sensationalist stories. And that was really the culmination of what had started with William Randolph Hearst and what had been continued through the advent of the silent newsreel and then radio, and then the marriage of sound and image together. But the next development wouldn't occur until FDR. Here, every actor in the media, whether it be the radio, whether it be the motion picture companies, whether it be William Randolph Hearst newspapers, they hid the fact that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, suffered from polio and was unable to walk, because they had an agenda that goes back to Woodrow Wilson's control over the media and over the types of stories that would be given to the public during the First World War, and that was a solid partnership with the Democratic National Committee or Convention and the news media. And this just continued with FDR because they thought that sharing pictures with the public of Roosevelt's ailment and inability to walk would mean that the people would necessarily think that he was not healthy enough or capable of carrying out the rigorous duties of being President of the United States. And they came to this agreement that they would hide this or sweep this under the rug. And that shows you just how detrimental these agenda-driven type news media sources and outlets are. And what we have today, going back to Megyn Kelly's shameful rant back on Monday, is kind of a continuation of this. They're going to keep pushing their agenda irrespective of the truth, irrespective of the objective reality as it unfolded in real life, because they only care about their agenda. Now, it used to be that this agenda was all about earning more money for them. But if you look at CNBC, their ratings are in the tank. CNN's ratings are lower than they've ever been. And so it would be all but impossible to say that their agenda now is about gaining profit for the company, because if anything, their their negativism and their sensationalism is actually hurting their parent companies. But they don't care, because they are so wholeheartedly, single-mindedly wed to this radical extremist left-wing agenda that they'll hold to it irrespective of whatever harm it would cause to their ability to make money or their ability to stay open. And it was, just started with that kind of hiding the health conditions of FDR, which means that, the man who served 3 terms as president had denied somebody else a chance, and the media had helped him deny this chance to other, arguably much more qualified candidates to hold the highest office in the land. And it's shameful, but we still have that sort of partnership with the Democrat Party and the mainstream media to this day. And you'd see it again with Kennedy later on, and I'll get to that here in a minute. But anyway, the broadcasting companies, CBS, ABC, and NBC, had also agreed to carry FDR's so-called fireside chats over the radio. Now, this was the first time that a politician had actually utilized the technology of radio to reach out to the living rooms of America across the country. This is where his attempts to push the New Deal really caught on, because he would give these evening fireside chats like some paternalistic, despotic, but benevolent dictator, reading out his plans of encroaching upon the fundamental and unalienable rights of every American citizen, to push for more government control, but claiming that he was doing it to end the Great Depression. This is where the notion of a chicken in every pot came from. And who would provide that chicken and the pot and the living room and your radio? Well, that would be the government. That was the first utilization of the mainstream media by a political personality to its greatest effect. You'd see this later on with Clinton and the television, or the televised State of the Union addresses of various other presidents over the years. But FDR had made it almost personal. And that's why they were called these fireside chats. But they were used to undermine the Constitution and to push these programs that really were unlawful, except for the fact that the gutless opposition party, as early as the 1930s, was already gutless and was refusing to oppose FDR. And the media continued to portray FDR in such a loving limelight, hiding the fact that he was unable to walk, hiding the fact that he was cheating on his wife, hiding all sorts of corruption allegations that existed behind the scenes, to paint this picture of him as this great, benevolent, and powerful, strong leader. And that's how he was able to stay in office for an unprecedented 3 terms. And in fact, that is why the Constitution was amended to prevent a president from holding office for 3 terms, because he was the quintessential American dictator. FDR really was nothing short of a dictator, because he completely disregarded the Congress, and he made all sorts of executive action decisions through his own hand-picked group of people that were not accountable to the American people, what he lovingly referred to as his kitchen cabinet. And the media kept this secret. They didn't report on it. They didn't shed light on the rampant corruption that existed throughout the Roosevelt administration. They continued to march lockstep with the radical left-wing vision that FDR had. And they didn't care. To them, it was as though they were radically transforming, or fundamentally transforming, to use the words of our current president, the nation. And they were happy to do so, eager to do so. They were just raring for the opportunity to force their view upon the American people, irrespective of whether that was the objective truth or not. And it obviously was not the objective truth. So FDR was able to do these sorts of, basically what you'd call public relations type activities, and by pushing propaganda through his fireside chat, and the people willingly allowed themselves to be duped into believing that he really cared about them. But he didn't. No, he really didn't. And this was, again, the rehashing of that loose-knit partnership between the mainstream media news outlets and sources of information and the Democrat Party that continues to this very day. It really was cemented during FDR's 3 terms of office. Now, during the Second World War, we saw for the first time embedded reporters being able to not only send back news reel footage with their discussion on it, but also live reports, oftentimes from the front line, over the radio. The BBC had actually broadcast up-to-the-date coverage of the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, including sound effects of bombs and anti-aircraft fire. Now, what all of this did was once again underpin and reaffirm that they were using sensationalism to sell information, making the journalist, or so-called journalist, the centerpiece of the story, and the facts kind of again fell by the wayside. It was an opportunity to sell and push propaganda again, and of course that's completely understandable during a time of war. The government's going to do whatever it can in its power to push for a positive light of the country, and in World War II, unlike any other time in history, there really was this concern that it was a fight for survival. Granted, every war comes down to that to some extent, but that really was an all-encompassing war because you had fascists and dictators of communist types as well trying to take control of the world. It really was an all-immersing global conflict. And the media was central to it. And they used terror to also make big news. Then we also see during the war politicians turning not only to the radio but to the talking picture to push their message during wartime and to push their agenda. And it became more and more and more commonplace that this relationship between politicians and the news media was now more important than ever. And it was this sort of symbiotic relationship, but the media was more or less collaborative with the politicians whose message they agreed with the most. But they still kept it, sort of hush-hush and swept under the rug because they didn't want the people to discover what it was that they were actually doing or what their true agenda was. That had to be kept out of the limelight. And so it did kind of create this false perception that the news media was this benevolent organization that was just delivering news as any other news outlet might, and that they weren't pushing an agenda. And that creates the sort of false sense of security that the American people had, and they just absolutely trusted everything that was said. Because no one believed that the media would abuse this undeniable power that they had amassed for themselves to push a radical left-wing, extremist, anti-American agenda. But it is exactly what the media had done. They had abused that power. And it only got worse after the attack on Pearl Harbor and America entered the war. Then they went out of their way to paint the communist regime of the Soviet Union as a like-minded ally that shared our point of view and our objectives in the Second World War. And they did everything that they could to convince us that the Soviet Unions had our best interests at heart, when nothing further could be nothing could be further from the truth. Absolutely not. Not with respect to what the Soviet Union was attempting to do and the agenda that the Soviet Union had propagated during the Second World War and after. They were diametrically opposed to the constitutional system of government that exists in the United States of America. But the media wanted to paint it out as though it was a shared objective that we all had to basically win the war for democracy. And see, that's when that little myth started. Folks, Jeremy and I have oft-times reiterated on past episodes of the Wright Flyer that the United States of America is not a democracy. We are a constitutionally endowed representative republic with democratic elections. In fact, Benjamin Franklin had defined democracy as two wolves and one sheep voting on what's for dinner. Odds are that sheep wouldn't be voting for anything else ever again. And that is why we aren't a democracy. But again, as early as World War II, we already, in fact, even as early as World War I, we had Woodrow Wilson and the media running with the idea of the war to win democracy, the war to save democracy. But it's not democracy. We are a republic. And they were just endlessly propagating this message and repeating the lie through propaganda enough to where they would dupe the American people into believing that they were something that they weren't. And this would allow them to continue with their agenda. And we see it to this very day, continuing through the mainstream media with outbursts like Megyn Kelly's shameful little attempt at comedy there back on Monday. But the propaganda was, pushed full on. And the actual truth about Stalin was swept under the rugs. And the media would go out of its way to ignore those who did happen to know just how destructive the Soviet Union could be and was, and the terrible things that they had done, like the famine that Stalin's 5-year programs had created, and the way that, the horrible and despicable way that he treated Poland and the Ukraine. The Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, but his policies, like any command economy type policies, any communistical system, doesn't work. And because of the arrogance and stupidity of a centralized government, he caused countless deaths. But he would sit there and he'd just laugh and smoke his pipe, and that horrific quote that I know that I've said it already on past episodes, but it bears repeating here. 1,000 deaths, that's a statistic. But one personal death, the death of one person, that's a tragedy. And the media knows how to play that game too. Because if you go back to the way that they were reporting during George W. Bush's administration about the number of deaths in Iraq every day, harping, then they would talk about the units and whatnot. Anything to paint it in a negative light, to turn American opinion against the efforts that were occurring there, that was done. And it goes back to this sort of propaganda and the policies that were originally developed by Joseph Goebbels to push forward a type of socialistic agenda. The Fabian Socialist, the National Socialists, and the Global Socialists, being the Communists, had all embraced this sort of radical ideology and approach to the dissemination of information. And with the bubbling cauldron, the boiling cauldron of sensationalism that had been created with William Randolph Hearst and then had evolved over the decades to what it had become by World War II, would then be meshed with this sort of system. And again, we could see that with the death of Roosevelt. Again, it was portrayed as this great harrowing tragedy, and yes, it was important to push forward a message of unity because America was still embroiled in the Pacific theater of World War II, and we were still in a massive fight. And then the media was very selective about what it covered even back then with respect to the gutless opposition party caving in and passing the New Deal yet again, making it perpetual, not allowing it to lapse. They painted the picture of Harry S. Truman as being this great and strong leader. And by the war's end, it was already made that you had a media in bed with a particular political party, but you also had them continuing to propagate this myth that they were providing the objective truth to the American people. And they said it with a straight face each and every time they'd get behind a microphone or do a radio broadcast or make a newsreel. They would absolutely convince any audience that, no, we're telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But they weren't. They really weren't. And we could see it with the type of propaganda that led up to the Korean War. And when it was shown that communism was a real threat, not just in the Soviet Union, but also in China, where we had turned our back on the Kuomintang, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek, by various radical left-wing elements in Congress and in Roosevelt's so-called kitchen cabinet, giving weapons to the Kuomintang, but then also giving them the wrong ammunition, and yet they'd never have these problems with Mao Zedong and his People's Republican Army, which was just a communist front. And once communism was absolutely and totally entrenched in China, the media didn't really know how to act, because all of a sudden both the Soviet Union and Red China were speaking in a unified voice against the United States. And then when we went into Korea and pushed the communist North Korean army out of Seoul all the way back up to Pyongyang, all of a sudden the Chinese started rushing across the border. And that myth, that absolute media-propagated myth that the Soviet Union and that the Chi-Coms shared our vision and goal, it collapsed. Forever. Forever. It absolutely disappeared. And it shows just how dangerous this sort of marriage between one particular political party and the mainstream media is. Because all of a sudden we had our national security being challenged, and most of the people didn't know about it because of the way that the media had been. And in other words, the party that was most incorrupt, or not incorrupt, but the most incompetent with respect to these issues, had led us down this path to a potential crisis. And Douglas MacArthur was sacked for it, was for these claims that he would use the nuclear bomb against China, and then all of a sudden, instead of pushing for victory, which we were within inches of securing, we settled for ending the conflict and leaving the country divided at the 38th parallel. And that has left us with the undeniable threat of North Korea, which is still there, which is still proving to be a thorn in the side of the United States, and that too was propagated and allowed to happen due in no small part to the agenda of the mainstream media. And this is still seen today, the way that the media works. You could see it develop with the way that the mainstream media handled Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare, and that was really kind of a changing thing with the advent and popularization of television sets. They took the place of the radio, and now all of a sudden the newsreel could be brought into the living rooms of every American's home and household, and that radically changed the way that media acted and journalism was carried out in America. And by 1950, you have Walter Cronkite with this new upcoming television news media, who liked to tout himself of, well, that's just the facts, folks. But in actuality, he was married to an agenda. He hid the illicit scandals that eventually developed behind, JFK, his illicit affairs, his back pain, and his shortcomings and scandals. These were all swept under the rug, and well, this is just, and that's the way it is. Is the other thing he'd say. Well, that's the way it is. So he and other news personalities such as Roger Mudd and then Mike Wallace would shape the way that certain stories would be perceived, in the way that they would do slanted reporting, and this really came to a head during the Vietnam War. Absolutely came to a head during the Vietnam War. They went out and said that the Tet Offensive was a disastrous defeat for the United States, when in fact it wasn't. Tactically speaking, even strategically speaking, we had won everything. But the media poisoned the American population and set it back, ultimately leading to defeat in Vietnam. Not by the military, but by the media and this cultural revolution that they helped spurn. There's this counter-revolution, or counter-culture, as they called it, that was poisoning and infesting the country all throughout the 1960s. And part of the reason that our returning veterans and troops were treated so poorly was because the media portrayed them as baby killers, portrayed them as going out and creating My Lai massacres each and every day over there in Vietnam, when it wasn't the truth. But that was the perception that they created through their slanted and disingenuous reporting. And this is the sort of thing that carried over to the modern day. We certainly can recall what Dan Rather did with trying to dig up dirt on George W. Bush about claiming falsely, erroneously, that he had been AWOL, when in fact nothing further from the truth could be. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth than what Dan Rather was doing. And yes, he was actually held accountable for that. And it also brings up, well, who was it? Brian Williams, who was recently caught in a web of lies. And this is all just showing that the veneer that the mainstream media had developed for itself, going all the way back to William Randolph Hearst, is finally starting to come apart. Because once you tell so many lies, it gets difficult to keep track of them. And when you can't keep track of them, you're bound to make a mistake, and you will be crucified in the court of public opinion. And that is what we are seeing with the development of social media and the internet. The internet revolution has allowed, programs like we here at the Wright Flyer to come into existence, and it is once again giving power back to the people, taking away the authority from these sorts of conceited news media sources and outlets like the mainstream media has been, as it's developed, back to the people, so that it's almost like having those little local newspapers again, and the people having a wide variety of diverse sources from which they can determine what is good, what is the truth, or what isn't. They can decide for themselves. And that's how it really is. Not this sort of fake picture, agenda-oriented picture, as thrown out by the likes of Walter Cronkite, Roger Mudd, and Mike Wallace. And Megyn Kelly is just an outcropping of this original nebulous sort of mainstream media that had a compact with the Democrat Party. Except in her case, the compact is with the detente wing of the gutless opposition party, or GOP. But it's all the same smoke and mirrors, dog and pony show that we have seen from this media for well over a half century. And it shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. And there is so much more that could be covered about this, but I think that for now we've covered most of what it is that made the mainstream media what it is today, and why it is actually doing a great disservice to the American people when you see this sort of agenda-driven propaganda. And it's really, really drawn out, been with us for a long time. And that's tragic. But now that the internet has provided us this avenue to seek the answers and information for ourselves, it means that we can empower ourselves by going to the primary sources, by sifting through all of the information that's out there and making well-educated decisions and determinations for ourselves. That is why Jeremy and I always say that the most important service that we can render to you, our cherished listening passengers and audience, is to provide you with the tools necessary for you to gain a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared Constitution, and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights. And now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. As always, this is your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for flying with us today, and I invite you to comment and share your thoughts on these shows, either on our Facebook page or on YouTube or at our Google Plus page. And I also invite you to join Jeremy and me the next time we take to the friendly airwaves to fly you over those airwaves in comfort and style. Thank you again for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. See you next time, folks.